getting a traditional publisher to consider and then actually publish your book is an achievement by itself. Then there's money and time and editing and printing and distribution. I mean, it's definitely not easy. I'm excited to talk with Dr. Aditi Paul today, who teaches at Pace University in New York City. Aditi's research has been published in top academic journals. It's been featured in Washington Post and NBC News and Women's Health and Telegraph and Huffington Post. I mean, amazing. Our conversation today is even more relevant because she's just published an academic book called The Current Collegiate Hookup Culture, where she advocates kind of moving past those traditional assumptions to really understand the current hookup culture on American college campuses. So Aditi, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Komal. I'm very excited for today.
Yeah, and I'd really like to kind of focus our conversation today on this whole business of academic publishing. So let's start here. Tell me a little bit about your book.
So my book, as you said, the name, The Current Collegiate Hookup Culture, I tried to make it as obvious as possible. Over the pandemic, I got really curious about what does it mean when people say they hooked up, and that came from my previous research on online dating apps like Tinder. I'm sure you've heard that Tinder is touted as the hookup app, and in true academic slash researcher fashion, you get really curious about that one thing and you want to uncover the entire universe behind that one word, and that's how my research started on hookups. And the first book that I read was Lisa Wade's American Hookup, the culture of sex on campus, and a lot of what Lisa was talking about was very relevant. But I also couldn't shy away from noticing that a lot of the things that she talked about didn't tap into the current culture that my students were telling me. So, for example, in her book, she talks about the party culture, about how you go to fraternities and sororities, and those are hotbeds of hookups. But then only a very small fraction of the college student population belong to Greek life. So what about the rest? If you're not in Greek life, are you not hooking up? And especially as an international student where I didn't get access to Greek life, but I sure did want to know more about what is this hookup culture, because that's what we see in American television and movies. So that's where my research idea germinated, that okay, is Tinder changing that landscape? Has it added another venue for hooking up for populations that didn't have access to quote unquote the societal privilege of being in the elite in campus? So one thing led to another. The more I read, the more there was to know. So within this book, I look at mainly three themes. The overarching theme is how have dating apps transformed the hookup culture? Like, has it really added fuel to fire? The second theme is what are the sexual, mental, and health outcomes of participating in hookups? Is it as bad as they make it sound? And the third thing was what do they do in a hookup? Like, I know what happens on a date, but like, what happens in a hookup? Like, who even decides? Is it as free flowing? Do you eat? Do you drink? Do you just like go straight to the deed? What is happening? So that was my morbid curiosity about college life, and it led to a book.
Oh, this sounds amazing. Now, your book is, as I understand it, fairly data focused, right? So it's kind of an academic book. So tell me what constitutes like an academic book?
An academic book is not a trade book. That's how I know through negation. Where an academic book, the expectation is that your audience is mostly comprised of academics and grad students for upper class students, as well as for libraries. So we are looking more into quote unquote, give me the data, tell me the argument, give me the backstory. So in my head, the way I make sense of it is a large research paper with a lot of dimensions to it. And when I got feedback, and we can talk about that as well from the reviewers, one of the comments was make it conversational. And then I went back to my editor and I said, do I have to make it like, how do I make it kind of conversational? I don't know. And she said that you don't have to worry about that. Don't make it conversational, make it like how you would write a research paper. So in that way, it could differ from a trade book in that it's not as conversational, it's not as warm. When you're reading, when the writer of a trade book is trying to pull in the reader. But even within those constraints, I have tried to make it accessible, and one of my reviewers has said that I have done it. So I'm going to take his word for it.
Good. Wow. So let's kind of dig a little bit deeper into this, right? The whole process of, like, beginning to end, finding a publisher. What are the nuts and bolts? Like, give me some idea of what it was like for you.
So it all started, I'm telling a story over here. It all started in 2019.
I love it. No,
Um,
please. That's the whole point. The stories we tell. Yes, go
yeah.
on.
So it started in 2019 when I was at a conference in Spain, and one of the editors from Routledge reached out. I think she was an acquisition editor, and she said, "Hey, we really like your research. Would you consider writing a book?" And I didn't know, like, how do you even write a book? Like, I know how to write research papers, but writing a book seems to be intimidating, isn't it? Like, oh, to think that you can write a book. And I honestly didn't think that I had the material which deserved to be written in a book format. So I had a conversation with her and I said, okay, if this woman trusts I have the ability to write a book, who am I to judge? So I had a conversation with her, and she said, well, there are different ways you can write a book. And the first proposal that I put together was, now that I think about it, it was a very glorified literature review. And I got a scathing review from one of the reviewers because at that time I sent a book proposal to her, and I still remember because those words are written on my skin like etched, where this person said, while I have no doubt that Dr. Paul is well able to write a literature review on online dating, I don't think she has anything new to add. And I said, oh my gosh, do I feel fraudulent or what? But that gave me an opportunity to really recalibrate and think through the truth to what this person said. And I read this book again, and I can talk about the books that I read to become a better writer. One of the books said that, we as writers, because we get feedback, you're putting your work out there. It's very important for us to identify bad feedback from good feedback. And based on some of the guidelines that this person had given in the book, I could recognize that this was good feedback. So I was not going to brush it away thinking that, oh, you're such a hater. I took it to heart, and I had a conversation, multiple conversations with people who had written a book. And I started with professors and scholars in my department. And based on their takeaway, based on from their conversation, I could see what was lacking in my book proposal, that I didn't have a novel argument that I was putting forth. I was just regurgitating what everybody else had done. And that really put me on a positive spiral, like, okay, let me read. That's when the Lisa Wade book happened. That's where my nosedive into hookup literature happened.
Wow. So it's all the introspection, eh?
Absolutely, yeah, and it really does take a thick skin to like not be completely crippled by these feedback. And anybody who has worked in academia knows that reviewer two is notorious. Yeah, but so you really do have to like humble yourself, be have an have equanimity, and then do the work.
Yeah. And so when you started the whole writing process, what was the most time consuming?
My book got accepted on a proposal phase, and I'll be the first person to tell you when it comes to writing abstracts or like, extended abstracts, the abstracts are really good. They're sexy. But when it comes to writing a whole research paper, that's when you're just like trying to just put things together.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me that I wrote a really mean book proposal, but now the rubber meets the road. Like, how do I flesh this out into from one point to like a whole book, a whole project?
Yeah.
So the longest time that it took for me was to finalize the questionnaire that I had to administer to students,
Mhm.
because one, first of all, you're dealing with a topic which is very sensitive, right? You're asking about the sexual activities of 18 to 24-year-olds, and there needs to be a certain kind of trust. There needs to be a certain kind of legitimacy to what you're doing. So I wanted to make sure that when I'm putting my application to the institutional review board, that I legitimize every question that I'm asking to students and have a motive for that. So finalizing the questionnaire, coming up with questions, reviewing existing scales that measure the concepts that I wanted to measure, doing an exhaustive search on that took the longest time. And soon after that, the longest time that it took was to analyze the data, where I, I had to match the data analysis with research questions, because once you have data, you can just play around with it so much. You can beat it up in different ways to tell any story and that story could be baseless, right? I mean, we are notorious for just using two unrelated variables and coming up with a relationship and saying, look what we have found. But to ground that back to theory, to ground that back to a legitimate research question, was an investing process as well.
Yeah, so it goes beyond like the slicing and dicing, right? Really kind of understanding
Absolutely.
and connecting it back.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So let's say like you worked on this whole process, the book, the manuscript is ready. What do you do? Like you give it back to the publisher. What happens after that?
So once the manuscript was ready, the first draft,
Yeah.
I had a timeline because starting in March 2020 is when the book proposal got accepted. Then from April through almost June, I did my literature review, got into IRB, won an award from Pace University of $1,000 to support my data collection because I wanted the data to come from a nationally representative sample. And then I thought, okay, from June through December, I will be done writing this book. It's going to be crisp. And I was almost on track up until coronavirus hit my system. That too on January 31st, 2020. And that really derailed my plans quite a lot, because the aftermath of COVID, thank God, I was very healthy to recover from it. But the psychological and the health toll that it took, I couldn't really put myself in a position to produce new knowledge. So that extended my timeline by at least 2 months.
Wow.
So everything said and done, I sent my first review out, which I was supposed to do in December. I sent it out on the March end side. And that's when I got feedback from reviewers, and finding reviewers to read a whole book can be a very taxing process, because you're asking another academic, and as fellow academics, there's so much on our plate anyway, to ask an academic mid-semester to read a 70,000 word manuscript. Of course it takes time, because everybody is going to wait till summer when they get time and they can read this book. I got my review in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I thought that was great, but then the review was very shallow. It was very evident that this was, again, going back to good feedback to bad feedback. This was not a well thought out feedback, but it worked to my advantage because I took what I got,
Yeah.
and I rephrased a lot of things. Some of the things that this reviewer said were legitimate. So, for example, citations and keeping the tenses together. So the syntactic things made sense to me, and I went back and tightened everything.
Mm.
So that took between June through July mid. And
Mhm.
after that, the book went into production, and the production phase took almost 4 to 5 months. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And then they would market the book to libraries. Is that how it would work? the publishers?
So the publishers have a quota every single year to hit.
Oh,
So they do not have the highest priority to promote your book. So what they do is they price it in a way that is more B2B friendly. So they're not really looking for B2C sales, for which reason my book is priced at $95. I mean, as much as I'd like to pocket that money, none of it is going to me.
yeah.
Not, I mean, a majority is going to reside with the publisher. So the way they market the book is to libraries, so libraries can buy it, so they can garner that type of sales. So it becomes very unique because now you have a book, but the publisher doesn't have the highest priority of promoting your book. So you find out avenues
Mm,
to make your research accessible, and that's what I've been doing right now.
excellent. Wow. It's not all rosy. I mean, this is you're
Oh,
still, oh yeah.
it's worth it.
Oh, it's worth it. I think you've done, I mean, that's such a great learning too, right? I
Oh
mean, the
yeah,
whole
it
process
was.
and
Yeah.
even getting a publisher to say, you've got something great and I'd like to publish it. I mean, that's just amazing. So you
Yeah.
should be really proud. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
If there is a professor,
Mhm.
who is trying to do exactly what you did, what would be sort of like the one advice you would give them?
Do it, because that's what I had to get over that hump really fast. Because when you're a professor or with a PhD, the paradox of the situation is now that we know how to know more, we don't think we know enough. That is the paradox of the situation where we don't think that I don't have enough to be offered up in the form of a book. And that is the reason why we think, oh, let me just establish myself, let my H index go a little higher, let my citations go a little higher, let me develop this body of knowledge.
Mm,
um, and we delay our, for the lack of a better term, our right to publish a book.
mm,
So, in that way, I would say if you think that you have enough to produce research,
mhm,
so much so that it can get published in a book, do it.
do it.
And that gives us an opportunity to develop a way of communicating with our audience in another way, right? Writing a research paper is one thing, providing conference presentations is one thing, writing a book is another thing. So the biggest learning experience for me was the fact that I gained a new way, I gained a new skill of communicating my research with an audience, which I would not have gotten if I didn't take up that first offer that came in 2019, where this person was like, do you want to write a book? Yeah.
Wow, yeah. And I still have like so many questions. I know our time is up, but I want to ask you a couple more, just like real quick ones, okay? Let's say somebody approached you, so that was great. But what if somebody wants to go out there and they may have to approach other publishers? Do you know how that works? Like, should they even do it?
I should also preface it by saying that I was approached by Routledge, but then I published with Lexington, because with the Routledge person, it didn't really work out. So when I was rehashing the first proposal,
Mhm.
I cold contacted publishers, academic publishers all across the board. And I said, I'm looking to write this book. What is the process? And more often than not, they're very receptive. They will look you up, and you should have earned enough stripes for them to at least have a conversation with you. And I did that. I reached out to a bunch of publishers. A bunch of them ghosted me. A bunch of them got back to me and said these are the requirements. And out of all those numbers, Lexington is the one that worked out at the time.
Wow. Okay. So yeah. So you do have that experience. So it's not
Yeah.
just yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then last question. I promise I wrap up. Self-publishing,
Mhm.
is that something? I mean, if you had to do it again, would you consider that? I mean, just publish it on Amazon and just put it out there, and then do your own sort of PR.
Yeah, self-publishing is a very lucrative way, and I have so much respect for people who have self-published. I have two people in my network. One of them is my then undergraduate student, Francisca Pugh. She published a book. It was an anthology of sorts, or short poetries. And I also have Dr. Matthew Kushin, who published a book on social media and how that should be taught to students. And both of those books are fairly priced. That gives you a lot of independence to do what you want to do, because that's your intellectual property. Nobody says what you can or cannot do with that. So that sense of independence is wonderful. At the same time, just with any entrepreneurial self-driven venture, you're the person who dictates the success or lack thereof of the book. So a lot of it depends on you.
On you. Yeah. So risks, but rewards, right?
That's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you today for your time, Aditi. This was wonderful. I'd love to provide a link to your book to the viewers and to
Absolutely.
all Speaker Post
There
members.
you go. I've sat with it.
Yay! That's awesome. Yeah. And I know that the journey that you've shared, the story that you told, will help someone somewhere. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Komal, and I really do appreciate you cultivating a platform like Speaker Post and giving us an opportunity to share our stories. Thank you again.
Thank you.